At dawn, the calm waters off Fort Pierce, Florida, were broken by shadows moving fast across the radar screen. Four boats, painted dull and low to the waves, slipped past fishing lanes with no signal, no registration, no flag. To coastal patrol operators, they looked less like civilian craft and more like a strike team advancing in formation. Within seconds, alarms spread through the command chain. What seemed like a simple blip on a screen now read as a potential incursion. Surveillance drones caught clearer images. The decks crowded with people, some holding bags tight against their chests, others keeping their heads down. It wasn't only human cargo. Hidden under the deck lay nearly 370 pounds of compressed cocaine, packed into watertight containers. This was not a smuggler's gamble. It was a logistical pipeline designed to deliver drugs and people at the same time, cloaked in the chaos of mixed cargo. For American forces along the coast, it was a direct test of reaction time. With the land border harder to cross, traffickers had opened a new front at sea, and now they were pressing directly into Florida's waters as if the U.S. coastline were undefended. The message was clear. If America blinked for even a moment, these boats would vanish into the inlets, their passengers and cargo disappearing inland. But what if this wasn't just smuggling? What if it was the first stage of something larger, an infiltration disguised as migration? Could U.S. forces react fast enough to shut it down before the threat multiplied? By 5:30 a.m., the response was already moving into position. Coastal radar stations had fixed the 4 unidentified targets, their coordinates flashing red across digital maps like hostile aircraft intruding into sovereign airspace. Operators watched the data scroll in. Speed, heading, hull size, all confirming these were not fishing craft drifting home. At 20,000 feet, a Navy P-8 Poseidon surveillance jet swept its sensors over the waves, relaying thermal imagery back to the Joint Operations Center. The feed left no doubt. More than 30 people packed tightly on deck, barely moving, their body heat glowing against the cool sea surface. The order went out across multiple channels at once. Coast Guard interceptor craft launched from Fort Pierce, their twin diesel engines roaring to life. Within minutes, the 87-foot cutters were pushing past 50 knots, close to 90 kilometers an hour, cutting across the waves with armed crews braced for contact. Each vessel carried a stabilized .50 caliber machine gun mounted forward, fast response boarding teams, and infrared cameras capable of piercing the morning haze. The smugglers had counted on darkness and confusion, but the sea was no longer theirs. One boat, realizing it had been painted by American radar, tried to break away at full throttle. The chase was sudden and violent. Alarms shrieked across the Coast Guard decks, searchlights snapped on, and engines screamed as the hulls knifed through the surf. White spray exploded into the air as boats twisted and turned. The distance closed rapidly. Every second mattered. At these speeds, a mile of ocean could be erased in less than a minute. The situation looked less like law enforcement and more like a naval skirmish. Gunners stood over their weapons, safeties off but fingers hovering just shy of the trigger. If smugglers produced rifles or RPGs, the order could shift from intercept to engagement in a heartbeat. Overhead, a Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin helicopter circled, its infrared scope locked on the fleeing craft, relaying live video down to command screens. The intercept unfolded with the discipline of a precision drill. Communications bounced across encrypted channels. DEA liaisons identifying likely narcotics handlers, Homeland Security tracking migrant identities, FBI agents mapping financial leads, and county sheriff's deputies preparing to process detainees on shore. Each link was part of a larger maritime kill chain: detection, identification, tracking, interception, and neutralization. Every box was checked in rapid sequence, proof that years of counter-narcotics operations had hardened U.S. units into something closer to combat readiness than ordinary policing. On board the target vessels, panic was already visible. Passengers huddled in silence, bracing against the spray. 2 men near the stern suddenly heaved black duffel bags into the water, attempting to dump evidence before capture. But the American interceptors were already closing fast. Grappling guns fired with a crack, thick lines latching onto the fleeing hull. Boarding ladders slammed down, and within seconds, U.S. agents in ballistic vests surged across the decks. Commands cracked over the engines as agents forced everyone to the deck. The smugglers had no chance to resist. Agents forced compliance at gunpoint, zip-tying wrists and clearing each suspect. Behind the frightened migrants, compartments were pried open to reveal the truth. Stacks of tightly wrapped cocaine bricks, each weighing more than 10 pounds, wedged under loose deck boards and sealed against seawater. Nearly 370 pounds in total. For the Americans, the discovery was chilling, but not surprising. This was proof of a dual-use system where narcotics and human beings were deliberately intertwined. Migrants were not passengers, they were camouflage. If the boats were stopped, smugglers could claim it was a humanitarian mission. If the drugs were spotted, the presence of families and children might complicate enforcement. Each element was designed to shield the other. The migrants themselves were victims of another equation. Mostly Chinese nationals, they later admitted to paying between $30,000 and $35,000 each for passage. To the traffickers, they were simply another commodity. People priced like cargo, generating as much profit as cocaine itself. Every body on that deck represented a transaction in a multi-million-dollar shadow economy. But even with the boats under control, danger lingered. No one on the water could be certain if the smugglers had heavier weapons hidden in compartments. Boarding in the open sea felt like stepping onto hostile ground, where any sudden move could spark bloodshed. U.S. teams swept each cabin methodically, clearing spaces, seizing radios, checking for hidden firearms. Tension stayed high until every compartment was confirmed secure. Only then could commanders breathe. The mission had ended without shots fired, but the atmosphere aboard the cutters told another story. Sweat-soaked vests, hands shaking as adrenaline drained away. One Coast Guard officer later compared it to a combat patrol. You prepare for rescue, but you move like war. Florida's coastline felt less like a border than a front line. So if you were the commander, would you board first to secure evidence or fire a warning shot, knowing one mistake could ignite a firefight on America's doorstep? Once the suspects were in custody, the scope of the operation began to expand. Interrogations and seized phones pointed investigators inland toward a quiet residential block in Fort Pierce. What looked like a typical vacation rental turned out to be the control hub of the smuggling scheme. The Airbnb had been booked under false names, with guests who never stayed long and rarely appeared during the day. Neighbors reported late-night traffic, strange visitors arriving with suitcases, and short bursts of cell phone signals lighting up the area like a communications node. Inside, agents uncovered laptops, ledgers, and dozens of prepaid burner phones. Each one linked back to the transactions in the Bahamas, where traffickers had staged migrants after their flights from China. From there, the system moved like clockwork. Migrants paid fees between $30,000 and $35,000 per person. Money was layered through bank transfers and crypto wallets, and travel agents funneled them to Nassau. Once assembled, Bahamian crews ferried them across the water into Florida, with cocaine shipments packed in the same hulls. The combination was deliberate. Human cargo gave smugglers cover. They could claim to be ferrying desperate migrants, not organized contraband. At the same time, narcotics profits fueled the logistics. Together, the two streams made a multi-million-dollar enterprise that looked almost industrial in scale. This was not the work of small-time runners. It had the signatures of cartel influence, discipline, compartmentalization, and contingency planning. Every stage was insulated. The migrants never met the financiers. The Bahamian boatmen knew little about the Florida handlers, and the Airbnb cell acted as a middle layer between sea operations and inland distribution. It was the kind of structure designed to withstand raids and make prosecution harder. For U.S. agencies, the raid in Fort Pierce was more than just a win. It was a map of how enemies adapt when borders tighten. The smugglers had found a seam in America's defenses. The coastline, long and porous, where law enforcement presence is spread thin. By exploiting legal cover, tourist rentals, commercial flights, casual marina traffic, they had created a channel that looked ordinary until the moment it was exposed. If one temporary Airbnb could hide the beating heart of an international pipeline, how many other command nodes might already be operating silently along the coast? When the Fort Pierce Airbnb was raided and the smuggling cell collapsed, the evidence pulled from laptops and phones transformed a local victory into a map of something far larger. Cold numbers began to tell the story. Florida's shoreline stretches more than 1,350 miles, accounting for nearly 1/5 of America's total coastline. Every inlet, every private dock, every mangrove channel has the potential to serve as a gate for contraband and people to slip through. The issue was never just the 4 boats intercepted that morning. The real problem is what they represent: adaptation. As the US-Mexico land border has been hardened with fences, cameras, and heavy patrols, cartels have shifted their focus. The sea is now the new frontier, harder to monitor, filled with hidden approaches, and far easier to disguise under the cover of commercial and recreational traffic. From the Caribbean, from the Bahamas, from the scattered islands that dot the Florida Straits, smuggling routes form like veins of a hidden network, testing America's defenses with each attempt. The Fort Pierce raid shut down one cell, but the data recovered, GPS tracks, erased logs, and fragmented money transfers showed a larger system at work. And this wasn't just a shipment. It looked more like a campaign of infiltration, unfolding step by step along the US coastline. Statistics from the last 2 years reveal a sharp shift. Maritime smuggling attempts into Florida have increased significantly, while land-based interdictions along the US-Mexico border have begun to level off. In practice, this means that as fences, cameras, and patrols close one corridor on land, traffickers simply pivot to the sea, where the terrain is vast, fluid, and far more difficult to police. Recent incidents highlight the scale of the challenge. Off Key West, Coast Guard units intercepted a high-speed, go-fast boat carrying hundreds of pounds of fentanyl, packed in waterproof containers and bound for Miami. Weeks earlier near Jacksonville, a fishing vessel that appeared to be hauling nets was boarded. Hidden compartments revealed over 500 pounds of cocaine, its crew trained to pose as local fishermen. In both cases, the vessels blended seamlessly into normal maritime traffic until intelligence and surveillance exposed them. For every successful intercept, officials admit that others escape detection. The ocean is a chessboard with thousands of squares, and only a fraction can ever be monitored at once. Smugglers exploit this by designing routes like shifting shadows, one night using a tourist yacht, another night hiding cargo inside commercial shipping containers. To law enforcement, any vessel could be innocent, or it could be a Trojan horse. The picture is unsettling. The US coastline, often thought to be secure, is in fact riddled with vulnerable entry points. Each captured boat is a reminder that many others may already be moving unseen, their narcotics or human cargo dispersing inland before anyone realizes they arrived. Faced with rising threats at sea, the United States has layered its defenses in a way that resembles wartime posture rather than routine law enforcement. The Coast Guard, once thought of mainly as a rescue and patrol service, now operates as the front line of a maritime shield. Above them, MQ-9 Reaper drones patrol high-altitude orbits, their infrared sensors scanning for unusual wakes and engine heat signatures up to 200 miles offshore. At greater ranges, over-the-horizon radar arrays can detect low-flying aircraft or small vessels thousands of kilometers beyond the horizon, providing early warning before smugglers even approach U.S. waters. On the surface, the muscle of this network comes from cutters, like the USCGC Hamilton, a 418-foot national security vessel armed with a 76mm naval gun, close-in defense systems, and fast-launch pursuit boats. Its sensors feed directly into Homeland Security and Southern Command, making it both a patrol ship and a floating command center. When required, Hamilton works in tandem with Navy destroyers, like the Arleigh Burke class, bristling with tomahawks and Aegis radar, to lock down broader sea lanes. Above, MH-60R Seahawk helicopters sweep in to hover low over suspicious craft, rotors blasting salt spray while loudspeakers demand surrender. Every link is tied together in real time. A suspicious blip detected by radar in the Keys can be handed off to a Poseidon patrol plane, confirmed by drone footage, and intercepted within minutes by a cutter racing in at flank speed. The result is not simply interdiction, but deterrence. A clear message that the U.S. coastline is monitored by a web of sensors and steel. Strategists compare this system to defenses deployed in the Persian Gulf or the South China Sea, regions treated as frontline zones. By building a wall of eyes and engines around Florida, Washington signals that the Caribbean is no less important, that the homeland will not be left exposed. The data pulled from Fort Pierce also revealed something more unsettling. The operation was not the work of amateurs, but part of a sophisticated network stretching across continents. Intelligence analysts traced financial flows to shell companies in Asia, logistics support in the Caribbean, and enforcement muscle from South America. It was a global enterprise wearing the mask of small boats and rented houses. At its core were the cartels of the Caribbean and South America. Venezuelan groups with naval smuggling experience supplied boats and crews. Colombian syndicates, with decades of experience in narcotics trafficking, handled the cocaine pipeline. Bahamian operators provided staging grounds, exploiting their geography as stepping stones only a short sail from Florida's shores. Into this mix came Chinese nationals, moved not just as migrants, but as camouflage, human cargo that made a drug shipment look like desperate families trying to cross. The structure was deliberate and professional. Each layer was compartmentalized. The migrants rarely met the financiers. The Bahamian crews knew little of the U.S. handlers. The Fort Pierce Airbnb was simply one node designed to disappear and be replaced if discovered. To dismantle such a network requires more than a single raid. It demands a campaign of intelligence, cooperation, and constant adaptation. Crucially, this arrangement showed that traffickers were not just testing America's patience, they were testing America's defenses. By sending multi-purpose loads of people and narcotics, they forced U.S. forces into hesitation. Treat the boats as humanitarian crises or as hostile incursions. Either choice came with risk. It was a strategy designed to blur the line between crime and conflict, stretching resources thin while exploiting every seam in the system. The enemy, then, was not a handful of smugglers. It was a transnational cartel coalition, adaptive, resourceful, and emboldened by geography. And in the dark stretches of the Caribbean, they believed they had room to maneuver. When U.S. commanders describe maritime interdictions today, they no longer use the language of police chases. They use the language of combat. Each encounter off Florida plays out like a miniature naval battle, with speed, firepower, and discipline deciding the outcome. Take the go-fast boats favored by cartels, 40-foot craft with triple outboard engines that can push them beyond 60 knots, over 110 kilometers per hour. At that velocity, they skim the water like aircraft, leaving Coast Guard cutters struggling to close the gap. To counter them, the U.S. deploys interceptor vessels equipped with stabilized machine guns, forward-looking infrared sensors, and GPS tracking rounds capable of tagging a fleeing hull. Overhead, a Black Hawk helicopter drops low, its rotor wash flattening the waves while gunners lean out with laser designators. Floodlights and flares transform the night sea into a theater of shock and intimidation. Cartel crews respond with ruthless improvisation. Some jettison packages to lighten weight and increase speed, knowing that even if captured, partial losses still fund the network. Others hide among clusters of civilian yachts, daring U.S. forces to risk collateral damage. In one case, smugglers scattered into mangrove estuaries, abandoning boats while armed lookouts tried to slow boarding teams with small arms fire. These were not fishermen caught off guard. They were fighters in a shadow war. For Coast Guard and Navy crews, each intercept carries the adrenaline of battle. A radar ping escalates to a high-speed chase, then to warning shots arcing across a bow, then to the controlled violence of boarding. Teams storm decks with weapons drawn, shouting commands over the roar of engines. Every second is a calculation. Too much hesitation, and the smugglers vanish. Too much force, and the situation tips into tragedy. From the outside, it looks like chaos. Boats colliding in spray, helicopters circling, gun crews shouting over radio chatter. But to those on board, it is organized firestorm. A sequence drilled endlessly, the maritime equivalent of an ambush and counter-ambush. It is law enforcement only in name. In practice, it feels like war. And behind each encounter is the same question. How many more boats are moving tonight, beyond the radar's reach, playing the same deadly game just out of sight? Each intercepted boat, each arrested crew, and each ton of narcotics seized is more than just a tactical win. It is part of a larger campaign that defines how America defends its homeland in the 21st century. What the Fort Pierce case made clear is that the United States cannot treat these incidents as isolated crimes. They are pressure points in a much bigger contest, where transnational cartels exploit geography, technology, and desperation to probe for weaknesses. The American response has been to treat the coastline as a contested battle space, defended with the same seriousness as overseas deployments. UAVs orbit overhead, cutters steam along the horizon, destroyers and surveillance aircraft stand ready, while intelligence networks bind it all together. It is not just law enforcement, it is a maritime defense wall, built layer by layer. For every cartel attempt to adapt, the United States adapts faster, combining local sheriffs with federal task forces, patrol boats with advanced radar, human agents with AI-driven analysis. The message resonates far beyond Florida. America will not allow its borders to become blind spots. A Coast Guard cutter surging at flank speed, a reaper circling silently above, a destroyer's radar sweeping the sea. These are not just tools, they are signals. They tell allies that the U.S. can defend its own coasts with overwhelming reach. They warn adversaries that every move in the shadows can be tracked, intercepted, and dismantled. In the end, the bigger war is not only against smugglers, but against the illusion that they can operate with impunity. The United States has shown, once again, that it will treat any threat, whether from a hostile state or a cartel skimming the surf, with the full weight of its power. Here we wonder, with smuggling pipelines multiplying across the Caribbean, should America establish a permanent naval base in Florida, dedicated solely to locking down this threat before it grows beyond control? By the time the last suspect was processed and the cocaine sealed in evidence lockers, the scale of the Fort Pierce case was undeniable. More than 30 suspects were taken into custody: Bahamian crews, Chinese migrants, and US-based facilitators. Nearly 370 pounds of cocaine, worth tens of millions, had been seized. But the true prize was intelligence, phones, records, and transfers that showed this was not a local ring, but part of a global machine. For the United States, this was more than a bust. It was a demonstration. Shutting down one pipeline required the full weight of the Coast Guard, DEA, FBI, Homeland Security, and local sheriffs. Surveillance planes, cutters, and boarding teams all moved in sync, turning what looked like a drug seizure into a joint operation executed with military precision, compressed into the final hours before dawn. The outcome carried both pride and warning. America proved it could react with overwhelming force, but officials admitted that if it takes this much power to close one route, others may still be running silently just beyond the horizon. The message is simple. Smugglers adapt, but the U.S. adapts faster. On Florida's waters, the wake of 4 captured boats left a reminder: challenge America's borders, and the reply will not be a courtroom summons, but a show of national power built to erase the threat completely. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden battles and military secrets with us, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Military Power. Your support keeps us going. See you next time.